What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Primetime Sports Podcast, hosted by Jeremy Larry. So in this episode, I'm going to give a big breakdown of all of the big free agency moves in the NFL. I haven't really talked about too many of them. I did talk about the Stephon Diggs trade last week, but I haven't really mentioned too many free agent signings. Obviously, with baseball season starting up just about a few weeks ago now, and then obviously everything going on in March Madness, it was really hard to record on the NFL free agency. So going to break down some of the biggest moves now in this episode. I'll break down everything by position. But before doing so, I'm going to give my thoughts on the Giants letting Saquon, Barkley, and Xavier McKinney walk in free agency. Honestly, I'm fine with both of them leaving in free agency. I felt like $17 million per year for McKinney was too much money. I would have stayed around maybe $13 million per year, so $17 million is definitely too much. And then if you look at Saquon's payday he got, I think that was too much for the Giants as well. I was fine with each of the guys walking. Xavier McKinney obviously is a loss, but you can replace a safety. And Saquon Barkley, it's obviously tough seeing him leave. But I was fine with the Giants letting him walk. It's just really hard to see him, though, in a Philadelphia Eagles uniform. But at the end of the day, that is the business of sports. It is all a business at the end of the day. I know a lot of Giants fans were upset with Saquon for leaving the Giants, especially to go to Philadelphia. But the Giants weren't going to give him that money that he got from the Eagles. And obviously the Eagles have a good offensive line as well. Saquon is a kid from Pennsylvania, so it all factors in. And he's obviously in a position right now to potentially compete for a Super Bowl. So I think he obviously wanted to go to a team where he could win. And getting that money, especially in his home state of Pennsylvania, that would be huge for Saquon when he's looking at everything and trying to factor everything in. So nothing the Giants could really do. I wouldn't have given him the money he got from the Eagles. So I'm fine with both McKinney and Saquon Barkley leaving. It's just tough to see Saquon in an Eagles uniform, as I said. But it's really hard to give a running back that money, especially considering Saquon has had his injuries. The Giants' offensive line isn't any good, really, so he's not going to really be able to succeed here. And also, the Giants have other holes as well besides running back. Saquon leaves. Obviously, running back is now a need. But the Giants do have a lot of holes, especially on their offensive line, now in their secondary at the cornerback 2 position. So they do have a lot of holes to try to figure out. So paying a running back top-notch money just wouldn't have made any sense for the Giants. So let's start out now with some breakdowns of the biggest moves in free agency at each position. Let's start out with the quarterback position. Baker Mayfield returned to the Tampa Bay Bucks on a 3-year, $100 million deal. $50 million guaranteed. Surprised everyone last season with a very good year for the Bucks. I didn't really expect too much out of him, but 28 touchdowns, 10 picks in a playoff berth, exceeding my expectations by far. I don't think he's a franchise quarterback, but he had them competitive last year. It makes sense for them to maybe keep him for a couple more years. Maybe he's a bridge guy if they were to go out and get a quarterback within the next few years. As I said, I don't think he's a franchise guy, but he did have a good year last year, so it makes sense for them to bring him back. Next up, Kirk Cousins left the Minnesota Vikings to sign a monster 4-year, $180 million deal with the Atlanta Falcons. He tore his Achilles last year with the Vikings, so that is definitely a worry now considering he's not completely healthy coming into the season. But he had 18 touchdowns to 5 picks in just 8 games last year. Looked very good in that Vikings offense. Still a very well-respected quarterback that can win games in the NFL. Going to a loaded offense that has a lot of talent. Hopefully they add another receiver maybe at number 8. Maybe Romo Dunze would be that guy. They do obviously have Drake London. They have Bijan Robinson. They have Kyle Pitts. They do have a lot of talent in that offense. And I think quarterback was the biggest need for them. They obviously have a good offensive line as well. Quarterback is what they were missing last year. And I expect them to take a step up this year with Kirk Cousins at quarterback. Next up, Tyrod Taylor stays in the Big Apple, but not with the New York Giants. He signs a 2-year, $18 million deal with the New York Jets. He was solid as a Giants backup last year. Did have his injury issues, which is a problem, but a good insurance policy at the end of the day for Aaron Rodgers, especially at a low cost, just $9 million a year. Speaking of the Giants, Drew Lock signed a 1-year, $5 million deal to be the backup for the New York Giants this upcoming season. 3 touchdowns to 3 picks last year as the backup for the Seattle Seahawks. In his career in the NFL, 28 touchdowns to 23 interceptions. So 28 touchdowns, 23 picks. Not really a great ratio there, but at the end of the day, a lower-end deal money-wise for backup isn't a bad opportunity there for the Giants. Might as well have a low-risk, potential high reward if he's a solid backup quarterback, especially at that price of just $5 million. Next up, Jacoby Brissett signed a 1-year, $12 million deal to return to the Patriots. He will now be their backup quarterback, considering they're probably going to take a quarterback with a 3rd overall pick. Felger and Maz and everyone on the radio was freaking out over that signing when it first happened. But honestly, I think Brissett's a solid backup quarterback. He's not as bad as everyone's saying. He could be a solid bridge quarterback option, especially considering he's a veteran. He's been in the league a long time. I don't think this is a bad move here for the Patriots. In his career, 51 touchdowns to 23 interceptions. Also added in 15 rushing touchdowns over his career as well, so 66 total touchdowns over his NFL career. Last year for the Washington Commanders, 3 touchdowns, no picks. I don't mind this signing for the Patriots at all. Sam Darnold signed a 1-year, $10 million deal with the Minnesota Vikings. Maybe he gets a chance to start there, considering we don't really know what the Vikings are going to do in the draft. I know they have the 11th and 23rd overall picks. Maybe they trade up to try to get a guy. Maybe they just wait it out, see if the guy's there at 11. If not, and if the guy's not there at 23, maybe they just roll with Sam Darnold. You never know what's going to happen in the draft. Obviously, there's a lot of rumors going around right now, especially right now, considering the NFL draft's a week away. There's a lot of smoke screens going around. You can't really trust any of the reports you read this time of year. I know there's a lot of reports that the Vikings want to trade up, but you never know at the end of the day. As for Sam Darnold, I'm very high on him. I think he's a guy that could still be a good starter in the NFL. Just has to be better with decision-making. That's obviously a big part of being a quarterback in the NFL. But Minnesota is likely to take a quarterback, so maybe Darnold's just the bridge guy for just the first few games. And then they hand it over to Bo Nix, J.J. McCarthy, Michael Penix, or Drake May. We'll see what happens. Next up, Russell Wilson signed a one-year, $1.2 million deal with the Pittsburgh Steelers. He was cut by the Denver Broncos, which left a record-breaking $85 million in dead money. $85 million in dead money is what it left. That's more than the previous two top dead money contracts combined. And it's also going to leave a $53 million dead cap hit for this year for Denver. But they had to make a move. They had to get rid of him. Obviously, there was a decision to be made. If they could try to trade him, they would have tried to trade him. But no one was going to take on that contract, especially with all that money. And if you look at now what he's leaving, a $53 million dead cap hit for this year. Denver's in a hole right now. They don't really have a quarterback. Jared Stidham's technically the starting quarterback right now. I'd expect them to take a quarterback in this year's draft. Obviously, something had to happen, though. They had to move on from him. As for the Steelers, though, this is an absolute bargain for them. Just 1 year, $1.2 million. And definitely an upgrade over Kenny Pickett, who did nothing last year besides have a good preseason. I was higher on him because of the preseason last year, but was never really very high on him coming out of the draft. Russell Wilson last year had a good year, 26 touchdowns, 8 interceptions in 15 games. Kenny Pickett last year for the Steelers, 6 touchdowns, 4 interceptions in 12 games. Really struggled last year in his second year in the NFL. The Steelers ended up trading him just a few days after that, which I'll get into that in just a minute. But not a bad move here for the Steelers, bringing in Russell Wilson, just 1 year, $1.2 million. Definitely a low-risk, high-reward potential there, especially considering Russ did have a bounce-back year last season. Jameis Winston left the Saints for a 1 year deal with the Cleveland Browns. The last play of his career with the Saints was a fake kneel-down where he handed the ball off to Jamal Williams for a touchdown. Former Falcons head coach Arthur Smith was not happy with Dennis Allen after that, but obviously it wasn't Dennis Allen's fault. That was Jameis Winston calling that play in the huddle, and that ends up being his last play with the New Orleans Saints. As for Kenny Pickett, he was traded from the Steelers to the Eagles. The former 2022 first-round pick really struggled this past year. As I said, just 6 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. In his career in the NFL, 13 touchdowns and 13 picks in 2 years. I was not very high on him coming out of the draft. I did think he would be a better quarterback this year than he was in his rookie year. Doesn't seem like an NFL starting quarterback, though, especially considering what we saw out of him last year. The Eagles decided to trade a 2024 third-round pick, which was the 98th overall pick in this year's draft. They also added in 2 seventh-round picks in 2025. In return, the Eagles would be getting Kenny Pickett and a 2024 fourth-round pick. And now Pickett is in line to be the backup quarterback for Jalen Hurts this upcoming season. Another big quarterback trade. Justin Fields was traded from the Chicago Bears to the Pittsburgh Steelers in exchange for a 2025 sixth-round pick that could end up becoming a fourth-round pick based on playing time. If you look at Justin Fields and his career in Chicago, didn't really have much to work with. Obviously, getting DJ Moore this past year was great for him, but the offensive line was never ready, especially considering the team as a whole was rebuilding with him at the quarterback position. But the Steelers obviously need a quarterback, so this isn't a bad move for them, just giving up a sixth-round pick to become a fourth-round pick. As for the Bears in this position here, they were obviously a lock to take Caleb Williams, even though I think Justin Fields I would keep over Caleb Williams. I know they probably want to reset their salary cap, considering if you trade Justin Fields, you don't have to give him a contract extension within the next year. And if you get Caleb Williams, you're at least 3 or 4 years down the line before you have to give up more money and give him a big contract. So it made sense for the Bears to at least contemplate this decision about a trade. I would have kept him, but obviously they want to reset the salary cap and do get a potential draft pick in return that could be a fourth-round pick depending on playing time. In his 3 years in Chicago, Justin Fields had 6,600 passing yards with 40 passing touchdowns and 30 interceptions. Also ran for 2,200 yards and 14 touchdowns. I think he's very good, obviously, considering what he had around him. I think he could be a potential star here for the Steelers. Right now, I would start him over Russell Wilson, but they're in a good position. Very low risk, high reward potentials here with Russell Wilson and Justin Fields as their quarterbacks. So moving on, yet again, another quarterback was traded, and that was Sam Howell going to the Seattle Seahawks. Washington sent Sam Howell a fourth-round pick in 2024, which is the 102nd overall pick in this year's draft, and the sixth-round pick in this year's draft in exchange for a 2024 third-round pick and a 2024 fifth-round pick from the Seattle Seahawks. Those 2 draft picks are the 78th and 152nd overall picks in this year's draft, so they got a decent return there for Howell. He had a rookie year like I expected him to. I thought he'd have a good amount of touchdowns and a good amount of picks. He ends with 21 of each, 21 touchdowns, 21 picks. I said it'd be high in both of those categories because I expected that offense to struggle trying to protect him, which he was the most sacked quarterback in the NFL. But I also thought he'd have a good year with Terry McLaurin and Curtis Samuel. And he did have a good year, passing the ball wise, 21 touchdowns. The 21 picks, a good amount of those were bad mistakes, but that's just a rookie quarterback. They're going to make mistakes, especially in an offense where he was getting pressured as much as he was. Not a bad trade here for Seattle, though. Now the potential backup there for Geno Smith. So yet again, another quarterback was traded, and that was Mac Jones going to the Jacksonville Jaguars for a 6th-round pick. He will now be the backup there for Trevor Lawrence. Mac gets the fresh start he really needed. He needed a new start at some point. He didn't really have much around him this past year. The offensive line wasn't great. The weapons were probably the worst in the NFL, if not the worst, the second worst to the Giants. Neither one of those teams had really much to work with Daniel Jones and Mac Jones. The Giants' offensive line struggled. The Patriots' offensive line wasn't great either. And then you also added the fan base that wanted Mac Jones gone since the beginning of the season. They just completely ripped him to shreds and ruined his confidence. So now he gets a new opportunity in Jacksonville, and he seems to be happy. Here's a clip of his first press conference talking about his parents who only live 30 minutes away from the Jacksonville Jaguars facility. And here's a clip from Sophie Weller on Twitter.
Well, everybody else is, the other new free agents are looking at houses and apartments. Probably a unique experience for you right now.
Yeah, I do know the area good, and I don't think I'll be staying with my parents. So. Maybe, we'll see. But yeah, my mom's coming to pick me up in about 30 minutes. It's kind of nice when your mom can pick you up from work.
So obviously in that clip, Mac seems to be happy. Obviously a lot less pressure on him in Jacksonville as the backup than there was obviously in New England as a starting quarterback. In Jacksonville, he only has to be the backup, so there's lower expectations. And secondly, it's a smaller sports market. It's not like you're in Boston where everybody just rips you to shreds, whether it be on the radio or in the papers. Everyone was against Mac Jones, it seemed like, from the Patriots fan base to a lot of people on the radio, people in the media. So obviously things didn't really work out for him in New England, but he gets a new opportunity in Jacksonville, and hopefully he does succeed as the backup there for Trevor Lawrence. I still think Trevor Lawrence could be one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Did struggle last season. He didn't have as good of a year as I thought he would, but the talent is there. I do expect Trevor Lawrence to still take a step up and be one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. I'm not really too worried about that, but he hasn't completely performed to the level that they want him to. He did battle a lot of injuries last season. He played through a tough ankle injury. I believe it was a neck or a head injury. Might have been a concussion if I remember right. A shoulder injury. So he played through a lot of injuries at the end of the season. I do expect him, though, to have a good year this year, and I think Mac Jones will be the backup, but Mac may get another opportunity at some point to be the starting quarterback elsewhere. So now I'm going to move on and talk about the running back market, which has gotten the most interest in the open market this year in free agency. It's surprising considering in the past few years, running backs felt like the contracts they were getting offered were not anywhere close to the value they should have got. But it was reversed this year in free agency. Right away, day one and day two, running backs got a lot of interest, signed a lot of contracts right away. It seemed like people were really aggressive in getting the running back they wanted. We saw Aaron Jones get cut by the Green Bay Packers and sign a one-year, $7 million deal with the Vikings. A bargain deal for the Vikings, considering the talent Aaron Jones does bring to the field. Only 3 touchdowns this past year, though, in 11 games. Did battle injuries, but he's still a very good running back. We saw that in the playoffs. He averaged 113 rushing yards per game and had 3 rushing touchdowns in the playoffs. So obviously the talent's still there, but running backs do fall off very quickly. You never know when a guy's going to fall off like Dalvin Cook did last year. So that may have been why Aaron Jones only got a one-year deal, but still a bargain deal here for the Vikings. As for Derrick Henry, he signed a 2-year, $16 million deal with the Baltimore Ravens with $9 million guaranteed. Not a surprise that his time in Tennessee was over with. He did play in all 17 games this past year for them, 12 touchdowns on the ground, 4.2 yards per carry. Only averaged 69 rushing yards per game, though. That was his lowest since 2018. I'm not going to put Baltimore in the Super Bowl just because of this move. I know a lot of people right away were saying Baltimore was going to go to the Super Bowl because of this, but running backs fall off production-wise very quickly. As I said, look at Dalvin Cook last year, even look at Austin Eckler last season. They do fall off very quickly, and even though Derrick Henry I still think is a good back, I don't think he's an all-pro back like he once was in Tennessee. Only 4.5 yards per touch this past season, which was also another career low. I do think he's trending a little bit downwards. Speaking of Austin Eckler, he signed a 2-year, $11.4 million deal with the Washington Commanders. I think his time might be up. I do think he's getting a little bit washed up. He did have 20 touchdowns in 2021. He had 18 touchdowns in 2022. Just 5 touchdowns this past season. Only had 4.6 yards per touch this last year as well, which was also a career low. 3.5 yards per carry this last year, which was lowest by more than half a yard in his career. He also fumbled a career high 5 times this past season. So I do think he's a little bit washed up, but obviously Washington has the money to spend. They had a lot of money to use in free agency, and they want to get some help for whoever their quarterback is, and Austin Eckler can't help in the passing game. So 2 years, $11.4 million. Not like they gave him a 4 or 5 year deal. It's not going to really hurt them too much in the future, so it's worth, I guess, the gamble to hope he can try to turn back time. Moving on, Tony Pollard signed a 3-year, $24 million deal with the Tennessee Titans. After averaging 5 yards per carry in 2021 and 2022, he only averaged 4 yards per carry this past season. He was a Pro Bowler in 2022, though, with 12 touchdowns. but this past year, just 6 touchdowns. He lost his burst after suffering that leg injury at the end of the 2022 season. Didn't look the exact same this past year. Only averaged 4.3 yards per touch this past season, the lowest of his career, but I guess Tennessee thinks it's worth the gamble. They do need to fix their offensive line, so we'll see what they do in the draft with that 7th overall pick. I do expect them to take an offensive lineman, maybe with 2 of their first 3 picks. Next up, Saquon Barkley signed a 3-year, $37.5 million deal with the Philadelphia Eagles. $26 million is guaranteed. Honestly, as I've already said, I was fine with Saquon leaving the Giants. I was fine with the Giants letting him walk. We didn't have the offensive line to help him, and it's hard to give a running back all that money, especially considering when the Giants have so many holes. I don't regret taking him with the number 2 overall pick, and I appreciate all he did for the franchise. Obviously, got the Giants their first franchise playoff win since the 2012 Super Bowl, which was great, and obviously it was a big part of that season in 2022 for the Giants. But I do think it wouldn't have been smart for the Giants to give Saquon a big deal. I know he had 10 total touchdowns 2 years in a row, still a very talented back, but he's had his injuries in the past. And then also watching all of the Giants games, it just felt like he was hit behind the line of scrimmage more often than not, and that's because of the Giants' offensive line. Going from the 30th ranked run-blocking offensive line in the NFL to the first, he's definitely going to be in line, obviously, to have a great year with the Philadelphia Eagles. He did drop some passes this last year for the Giants. 3 of them went for interceptions. He was also 51st in true yards per carry at 3.7 yards per carry, so it's obviously not great, 51st in the NFL. Also was stuffed 62 times at the line of scrimmage, so 62 stuffed runs this last year, which is second most in the NFL in 2023. With that being said, though, he did have 12 breakaway runs last year, which was 8th best in the NFL. He still has some left in the tank, and now we'll have a good offensive line in front of him and has some good weapons around him in Philadelphia that could make him even better. The issue with him, though, is health and longevity. Here's what Philadelphia did, though. They only gave him a $3 million cap hit this year in 2024, so it's essentially a 2-year deal with his base salary being $11 million in 2025. That $11 million is guaranteed. He also has a $13.5 million cap hit for that season. If they do decide to cut him, though, before 2026, it would only be $8 million in dead money for Philadelphia with $7 million in savings, since they did add 2 void years at the end of his contract to try to stretch out that signing bonus. It obviously made sense for them to go out and get a big running back. Obviously, Saquon wanted to go to a team where he could try to succeed and obviously have an offensive line. It made sense for him to move on from the Giants as well. And then it seems like the Giants had to move on from him considering they couldn't give him all that money. So it's obviously hard to see him in Philadelphia, but I do wish Saquon Barkley all the best. And as I've said now multiple times, I was fine with the Giants taking him with the 2nd overall pick. I would still do it all over again. I don't blame Saquon Barkley for going out and getting the money that he got. The Giants weren't going to give him that money, as I said. But I do think the Giants have an opportunity here to try to figure things out and try to fix some more holes. Rather than signing a running back to a big deal, they use some of that money to fix the offensive line, also give Brian Burns a big contract. After they traded for him, they gave him a big contract extension. So they're filling out the more important positions in the game of football, the offensive line, defensive line. You got to win the game on both sides of the line of scrimmage. A safety and a running back just aren't valued as much, especially considering where the Giants currently are right now, especially in the cap space. And obviously the season they just had, it didn't make any sense for them to sign Saquon and Xavier McKinney to a lot of money. I know a lot of fans are going to be upset with it, but I am very high on Gary Brightwell. I've always been a fan of him. He's a very low contract. I think he has 1 more year left on his current deal. But the Giants did just sign Devin Singletary to a 3-year, $16.5 million deal. I do think Devin Singletary is a good running back. He's obviously not as talented as Saquon Barkley. No one's going to be as talented as Saquon Barkley was. I get that. But people have to stop thinking of this guy as Saquon Barkley's replacement. He's really just stepping in just because the Giants weren't going to give Saquon that money. They also have to go out and get some sort of running back to try to replace him. But it's not like the Giants signed him to say, okay, he's going to do what Saquon did. Even though he did have a good year last year, he's not as talented as Saquon is. But for the value, it's not bad value. 3 years, $16.5 million. That's not a bad deal there for Joe Schoen and the Giants. He had 4 rushing touchdowns last season, almost 900 rushing yards. He's had 800-plus rushing yards in 3 straight seasons. Also added in, he played 50 of 51 possible games over the last 3 years, so he's been basically healthy for most of his 5 years in the NFL, which is huge for the Giants. I think a worry with Saquon was his injuries, and having a running back that doesn't get hurt a lot is definitely helpful. And as I've said now multiple times, he's not as talented as Saquon. I'm not making that case at all. But considering Saquon was hurt a lot, having a running back that doesn't get hurt a lot could definitely help this Giants offense. Last year, Singletary averaged 53 rushing yards per game. And in each of the last 3 seasons, he's nearly had 1,100 total yards, which is huge for this Giants offense. They need a guy that can pass catch at the running back position. And considering the money he got, not a bad value contract there for the Giants. As for the Green Bay Packers, they signed Josh Jacobs to a 4-year, $48 million deal. He was excellent in 2022 with 1,653 yards on the ground with 12 rushing touchdowns, averaging 4.9 yards per carry. But this past season in 2023, just 805 yards. So that's less than half of the yards he had in 2022, he had in 2023. So that's a worry there for Green Bay. But he did have 6 rushing touchdowns this past season, did miss 4 games, but only had 3.5 yards per carry. I know that Vegas offensive line wasn't great, but that's still a little bit worrisome considering he didn't have as good of a year in 2023 than he did in 2022. And like I've already noted now multiple times, running backs do age pretty quickly. I do think Jacobs is still a good back, but 4 years is a lot for him. I would have said maybe around 2 or 3 years is the most I would have given him in a contract. I do think Green Bay was a little bit crazy giving him 4 years, but maybe that was the cost to go out and get him and make sure no one else got him. But I do think they might regret this at some point. Moving on, Joe Mixon was traded from the Bengals to the Texans for a 7th-round pick, and then the Texans gave him a 3-year, $27 million extension. He's coming off a good year with 1,000 rushing yards and 9 rushing touchdowns. Still 4 yards per carry and 61 rushing yards per game this past season. Houston gets an aging running back. He's going to be 28 by the start of the season, but he's a dual threat back that can help C.J. Stroud in the receiving game. And obviously still had a good year last year, so I do think this is helpful for the Texans offense, especially considering all the weapons they have. As for the Bengals and who they replaced him with, they signed Zach Moss to a 2-year, $8 million deal. Not a bad value deal here for Cincinnati. In his first 4 starts last year, Moss had 445 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns, and 8 catches for 72 yards and a touchdown reception. $4 million a year is very good value for a good pass-catching back that's only 26 years old and had a good season last year with Indianapolis. We'll see what he does in Cincinnati, but I do like this deal here for the Bengals. Next up, DeAndre Swift signed a 3-year, $24 million deal with the Chicago Bears. He had 1,000 rushing yards for the first time in his career this past season with Philadelphia, with 4.6 yards per carry on the season. He did have a career low, though, at 4.7 yards per touch this season, but he did have 1,263 yards from scrimmage, which was a career high, so it's pretty crazy. He had a career high in yards per carry and a career high yards from scrimmage, but a career low in yards per touch. This was the first time he was a Pro Bowler in his career. So he's coming off a good season there with the Philadelphia Eagles, but Philadelphia ended up getting Saquon. So DeAndre Swift ended up leaving at the beginning of free agency, and then Philadelphia decided to sign Saquon. But DeAndre Swift goes out and gets his money, 3 years, $24 million. And now Chicago's recouping their offense, getting DeAndre Swift, getting Keenan Allen, obviously getting DJ Moore last year, and probably adding Caleb Williams in the draft. This team is making moves, and they also have the 9th overall pick, so there's potential they add another receiver like Rome Odunze at 9, or add an offensive lineman like Talize Fuaga. They do have a chance to add even more to this offense. I'm excited to see what they do in this year's draft with the 9th overall pick. I think Caleb Williams is probably the 1st overall pick. He's a lock there for them, but with the 9th overall pick, it's going to be interesting to see what they do. Moving on to the last running back signing I'm going to talk about, and that is Gus Edwards signing a 2-year, $6.5 million deal with the Los Angeles Chargers. This is a great value deal. I think the best out of all of the deals I've talked about. This is the best value deal here. He's coming off a career-high 13 touchdowns this past season in a very rushing-friendly offense in Baltimore. He averaged 4.1 yards per carry, which is solid. He's also hovered around 40 yards per game for the last 4 years in Baltimore. May not be ready to take a full workload in LA. That might be the worry here, and that's why he didn't get as much money, since it's been in an offense where they had multiple running backs and obviously Lamar Jackson running the ball as well. But we'll see what he does with the Chargers. What made him dynamic is having Lamar Jackson in the option plays. Regardless, though, at the end of the day, this is a very good value signing here and a very cheap deal here with high upside for the Chargers. I do expect them to take a running back in the draft at some point as well and have a running back by committee there in that offense. So now I'm going to move on and talk about wide receivers. And Darnell Mooney got a big deal from the Falcons, 3-year, $39 million with $26 million guaranteed. That's an overpay in my opinion, but they do need help at receiver. It's pretty crazy how a wide receiver 3 or a wide receiver 4 in an offense can get $13 million, but that's just the way the NFL is trending nowadays. Everyone's getting paid, especially at the bigger positions, the more necessary positions to spend money on, like wide receiver, like tackle, like cornerback, like quarterback. You need those positions. You need a great tackle in today's day in the NFL. So that's why there's a lot of guys that are making a lot more money now than their position would have paid 10 years ago. Mooney getting $13 million is a little bit surprising to me. Just 33 catches last season, 414 yards and 1 touchdown for Chicago. But he's 2 years removed from a monster 2021 season where he had 81 catches for 1,055 yards and 4 touchdowns. Maybe the Falcons are hoping he can turn back time. We'll see what happens there. Moving on to Gabe Davis signing a 3-year, $39 million deal with the Jacksonville Jaguars. That deal will be worth up to $50 million potentially. Last year, Davis had 45 catches for 746 yards and 7 touchdowns with the Buffalo Bills. He's hauled in at least 6 touchdowns in all 4 seasons of his career in the NFL. So that's an impressive number right there. And now he slides into the wide receiver 2 position in Jacksonville's offense. I do think they need to add a receiver at some point. We'll see what they do. But I do think maybe adding a guy in the draft like Keon Coleman late in the first round, or Xavier Legette, or even a guy like Devontae Walker if they want to wait a little. I do think they need to add another receiver at some point, especially considering they lost Calvin Ridley. Ridley signed a 4-year, $92 million deal with the Tennessee Titans. He had 76 catches for 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns this past season with Trevor Lawrence. He was a little bit inconsistent, but I still think he can be wide receiver 1. Tennessee's had a good offseason, adding Tony Pollard, Calvin Ridley, L'Jarius Sneed. They had a solid offseason. We'll see what they do, as I said, with that 7th overall pick. Another receiver that was paid, Michael Pittman, got a 3-year, $71.5 million deal with the Indianapolis Colts. They wanted to keep him in town, so it made sense for them to go out and spend big money. He had a good year this past season. 109 catches, 1,152 yards, and 4 touchdowns. He's had 3 very good seasons in a row where he's had over 900 receiving yards or more and 4 touchdowns or more in each of those 3 seasons. We'll see what he does now with the big contracts. Sometimes guys do underperform once they get their money. We'll see what he does there with the Colts. I do think that's a little bit of too much money for him. I still think he's a good wide receiver, but $71.5 million for a guy that only had 4 touchdowns this past season, I think I probably would have given him around $18 million a year, but that probably wouldn't have gotten a deal done, especially considering wide receivers want more money nowadays. So I understand why the Colts had to do it. They had to go out and spend big money to try to keep him, and it made sense for them to do so, but I do think it's a little bit of an overpay. Next up, Mike Evans returns to the Tampa Bay Bucks, got a 2-year, $52 million deal with $35 million guaranteed. He had a very good season this past season for the Bucks, 79 catches, 1,255 yards, and 13 touchdowns. 13 touchdowns actually led the NFL in touchdown receptions. And a very interesting stat I saw, he's had over 1,000 receiving yards in all 10 years of his NFL career. Very impressive, and for sure a future Hall of Famer. Next up, T. Higgins was franchise tagged by the Cincinnati Bengals, but still wants a long-term deal. He could be traded for a second-round pick at some point. If I were the Patriots, if I were the Giants, I would definitely trade a second-round pick and go out and get this guy. I know the Giants just did that to get Brian Burns, but I think the Patriots could definitely be in position to go out and get a big-name receiver like T. Higgins. The Patriots also have money to spend. I don't really know why they didn't spend money on outside free agents really much this offseason, but if I were them, I would go out and spend and potentially try to get a guy like T. Higgins in a trade or Brendan Ayuk. As for Kendrick Bourne, he stayed in New England for a 3-year deal up to $33 million, 37 catches for 406 yards and 4 touchdowns this past season. Only played in 8 games, though, because of a torn ACL. I don't think he's as good of a receiver as most Patriots fans thought. I know a lot of them thought he could be a wide receiver 2. I do think he's probably a wide receiver 3 in most offenses, but the Patriots didn't have to sign him to a crazy contract, so at the end of the day, not really too much risk there. As for Marquise Brown, he signed a 1-year, $11 million deal with the Kansas City Chiefs. Coming off a season where he had 51 catches, 574 yards, and 4 touchdowns. He had a career-low 41 yards per game this past season. But that stat is a little bit misleading. He didn't have Kyler Murray for a majority of the season this past year for Arizona, so a little bit misleading. He's also battled some injuries, but I think that is a very good deal for Kansas City. I think he ends up being their wide receiver 1. If they don't go out and get a guy in the draft like Keon Coleman or Xavier Worthy or Xavier Legette, I think potentially Marquise Brown is their wide receiver 1. I do like Hollywood Brown a lot, but I do think Kansas City could add another receiver. I think Kadarius Toney is on his way out of the Chiefs' kingdom at some point. Rashee Rice got himself in some trouble this offseason. And then Sky Moore hasn't really lived up to his potential, so I do think the Chiefs have to go out and get a receiver at some point. And then also Travis Kelce at some point isn't going to be there to be their number 1 target on offense. I do think Travis Kelce was a little bit trending downwards in the second half of last season. I know he had a good playoff run, but I do think he's trending a little bit downwards. So we'll see what they do to go and try to get a big-name receiver potentially in the draft or go and get a guy in next year's offseason. I think Travis Kelce probably plays maybe 2 to 3 more years in the NFL, and maybe he's still very good for the next year or 2. I do think they probably go and get another number 1 receiver or number 1 target for Patrick Mahomes at some point. So now I'm going to move on and talk about the tight end position, which Gerald Everett signed a 2-year, $14 million deal with the Chicago Bears. 51 catches, 411 yards, and 3 touchdowns this past season for the Chargers. Always hovers around 3 catches per game. He's not a bad second tight end option next to Cole Kmet. He can make plays after the catch, which helps as well. And obviously that Chicago offense is really built this offseason, getting Keenan Allen, getting DeAndre Swift, and then also adding Gerald Everett. Hunter Henry stays put with the Patriots, getting a 3-year, $27 million deal to stay in New England. 42 catches for 419 yards and 6 touchdowns this past season for the Pats. He had some injuries in the past, but has stayed mostly healthy in his 3 years in New England. We'll see what he does on this new contract. Zach Ertz, 1-year, $5 million deal with the Washington Commanders. Didn't have a good season this past year for the Cardinals. Just 27 catches for 181 yards and a touchdown. To be honest, I think his time's coming up in the NFL at some point. Maybe plays another year or 2, but he has trended downwards over the last 4 years. Did have one very good season, but over the last 4 years has been consistently trending downwards for the most part. So now I'm going to move on and talk about the offensive linemen that signed big deals in free agency. But before I do so, I'm going to start off with the news that came out just about a month ago now. Longtime Eagles All-Pro center Jason Kelce announced his retirement. Kelce was with the Eagles from 2011 to 2023, making 7 Pro Bowls, winning a Super Bowl, and also was a 6-time All-Pro. I'd imagine the tush-push game is not going to be as effective without him, especially considering how good he was at audibles as well. I mean, that offensive line in general is going to struggle without him, but they still have a good amount of pieces on that line, and we'll see what they do at the center position. They do have a guy coming back in Cam Jurgens, who is supposed to be the center heading into the offseason. So we'll see if they do draft a guy, but as of now, Jurgens is the guy that'll take over for Kelce. But They're obviously going to have a little bit tougher of a time trying to run the ball, and obviously having Kelce up there to call audibles and help the quarterback, that's definitely going to be a major loss considering how good of a veteran he was on the field and in the locker room. Next up, Jermaine Illuminor signed a 2-year, $14 million deal with the New York Giants. He can play 4 spots in the offensive line. That is definitely good for this Giants team, having some versatility, but he likely competes with Evan Neal for the starting right tackle position. He had a 72 blocking grade last season for the Raiders, and had 7 games with no pressures and no sacks allowed. So not bad. Definitely an upgrade, I'd say, over Evan Neal as of right now. Evan Neal, he'll probably get one more shot at right tackle, and then after that, maybe he moves into guard or the Giants just move on from him. We'll see what happens. Evan Neal coming out of the draft, I was very high on him. I thought he was going to be a great pick for the Giants, considering they got him at the 7th overall pick, and he could have went first in that 2022 draft, but just things have not really seemed to work out for him yet in the NFL. He'll probably get one more shot, and then after that, the Giants will have to move on. I do have confidence how he can figure things out, because he has the size. You can't really teach size, but he needs to work on his technique a little bit. Seems like he opens too wide at times, and if you look at Andrew Thomas, I know he struggled as a rookie and then really took some big steps up over that rookie year, into that second year, into the third year. I hope that would be the same for Evan Neal, but it just hasn't really been the case just yet. Moving on, the Patriots kept Mike Owenu in New England with a 3-year, $57 million deal. They wanted to keep him, and obviously it came at a major pay grade, but they wanted to keep him in New England. He's in versatile for them. He's played left tackle, right guard, and this past season he only had 1 holding call against him and also 3 false starts, but just 1 holding call is impressive for the majority of a season where he played a lot of right tackle. So the Patriots will be happy with that, getting him back in New England. Obviously comes at a high pay grade, but at the end of the day, they had to keep him somehow, some way. I will say, though, I think that's an overpay, though, and we'll see how it works out for them, but I probably wouldn't have given him $19 million a year, but I know tackles are expensive nowadays. Moving on, Robert Hunt signed a big deal with the Carolina Panthers, leaving the Miami Dolphins, getting a huge deal from Carolina, getting 5 years, $100 million with $63 million guaranteed. Carolina needs to address that offensive line, and that's something they did in free agency, adding 2 guards right away to try to help out Bryce Young, which is huge to see that they're addressing the offensive line. Hunt got 5 years, $100 million. They need to help Bryce Young somehow, some way, and this was definitely a good move for them. Next up, Kevin Dotson signed a 3-year, $48 million extension to stay as the guard for the LA Rams. It does come at a hefty price, though, 3 years, $48 million, but he was a priority for them to keep on their offensive line. Next up, John Runyon signed a 3-year, $30 million deal with the New York Giants with $17 million guaranteed, a 65.3 pass block grade last season. He's given up pressures on just 3.5% of pass block snaps since 2020, which is 5th best among guards in the NFL. Last season, 574 pass block snaps, 22 quarterback pressures, and just 2 sacks allowed all season. Definitely an upgrade from what the Giants had to deal with last year with Mark Lewinsky. We'll see how things do work out on this offensive line, but the Giants did sign a good amount of free agents on their offensive line just to really have some competition heading into camp and also try to add to their depth, considering they had a lot of injuries on the line this past season. Moving on, Seahawks guard Damian Lewis signed a 4-year, $53 million deal with the Carolina Panthers. They addressed the offensive line early in free agency, which is great for Bryce Young. He needed help considering how much he got hit last season. Since 2021, Lewis has allowed just 7 sacks and 4.53% as a pressure rate, which is 11th best among guards per PFF since 2022. So not bad numbers there, considering 7 sacks allowed since 2021, and also a 4.53 pressure rate, which is 11th best among guards since 2022. Definitely an upgrade on their offensive line, and hopefully it should help Bryce Young out. Moving on, Lions free agent guard Jonah Jackson got a huge deal from the Rams, 3 years, $51 million. The Rams addressed their offensive line woes very early in free agency, just like Carolina. I do think this is an overpay in my opinion, though. 59.7 was the PFF grade last year for Jonah Jackson. And I know it's not all about PFF grades and stats. He only allowed 2 sacks this past season, but he did struggle in run blocking. And that's something that the Rams love to do. They love to run the ball with Kyren Williams. I don't really think he was worth $17 million a year, but we'll see how things do work out for the Rams. Moving on, Bills free agent center Mitch Morse got a 2-year, $10.5 million deal with the Jacksonville Jaguars. A great value deal, an experienced center who could definitely help out Trevor Lawrence, especially with trying to figure out some audibles. Only $5.5 million a year, or $5.25 million a year for a veteran center who still has some left in the tank is definitely a good move here for Jacksonville, considering they needed a center, and he definitely makes a lot of sense for them. Moving on, former Bengals first-round pick Jonah Williams signed a 2-year, $30 million deal with the Arizona Cardinals, getting much-needed help on the offensive line for Kyler Murray. They're likely going to take a wide receiver at number 4 or trade down. We'll see what they do, but addressing the offensive line was a major need for them in free agency or in the draft, and they've already started to do so here, getting Jonah Williams on a 2-year, $30 million deal. Now moving on to the edge rushers, Brandon Graham returned to the Eagles on a 1-year deal. He's been with the Eagles every year since 2010. There was a chance he was going to leave, and the Eagles were going to lose Fletcher Cox and Jason Kelce and Brandon Graham, but Brandon Graham does come back on a 1-year deal. Just 3 sacks and 16 tackles this past season. He's definitely in decline for sure. This is probably his last deal in the NFL, and if not this being the last, maybe one more year after this. The Giants made a big splash in free agency and traded for Brian Burns, who was still under contract with the Carolina Panthers, but the Giants made a major trade getting Burns in exchange for a 2024 second-round pick, which is a number 39 overall pick that the Giants are sending to Carolina. The Giants also sent a 2025 fifth-round pick and also are going to swap fifth-round picks in this year's draft. So the Giants will be getting number 166, while Carolina will be getting 141. The Giants gave him a 5-year, $150 million extension with an $87.5 million guaranteed total. He's only 25 years old. I do think this is a heavy, heavy payday, which does worry me a little bit, but the pass rush has been a problem for the Giants for years. He may make it easier on Kayvon Thibodeau and Dexter Lawrence. It's giving me 2011 defensive line vibes from when the Giants won the Super Bowl. He's going to make Thibodeau better, and he's going to make Dexter Lawrence better. The Giants did save a lot of money by letting McKinney and Barkley leave in free agency, and now they got some extra money to address the offensive line and defensive line, since those are more valuable positions when you're trying to build a team from the ground up. You have to build from the offensive line and defensive line. Running backs and safeties are just not as valuable positions, especially in the open market right now, giving them all that money. So the Giants will probably draft a safety and a running back in the draft, I'd imagine. The Giants only had 34 sacks this past season, which is 28th in the NFL. But if you look at it, they had a 45.4% blitz rate, but just a 20.9% pressure rate, which is 18th in the NFL there in pressure rate. So they need to get pressure without always blitzing, and now getting a guy that can get pressure on the quarterback is huge. The Giants were 7th in hurry percentage last year at just 8.8%, but they did struggle to get the quarterback down, which is a worry. So when you add a guy like Brian Burns, that should definitely help with that. I know Brian Burns didn't have a crazy sack total last year, just 8 sacks, but he is a 2-time Pro Bowler. He's had 9 or more sacks in 3 of the last 4 years, just 8 this past season. He had 12.5 in 2022. The issue this past season, he only had 8 sacks because Carolina was down in a lot of games, so they were playing against opposing teams in the second half who were just running the ball for the majority of the time just to waste the clock. So it's a little bit misleading looking at a sack total from this past year, but he is definitely a good pass rusher. I just don't know if it's worth that big contract, 5 years, $150 million, but we'll see how it does work out for the Giants. They were definitely interested in investing in their defensive line. It obviously comes at a major price, but that's just the way the market is nowadays. We'll see how it works out for the Giants. I'm a little bit worried about $30 million a year. I would have probably given him around $25 million a year, but I do think he can make Kayvon Thibodeau and Dexter Lawrence even better. And can't forget about Azeez Ojulari. He's a guy that's been hurt a lot, but maybe he becomes even better as well with a guy like Brian Burns, making the other team, the opposing offensive line, have to game plan for him. Now moving on, Danielle Hunter left Minnesota for a 2-year, $49 million deal with the Houston Texans. He's getting $48 million guaranteed, but he's still a very good player. 16.5 sacks this past season for the Vikings. A huge add to a young but rising Texans defense. He's a veteran, and obviously he's going to give a lot of tips there to the guys in the locker room. He's had double-digit sacks in 4 of the last 5 seasons, which is obviously huge to that Houston Texans defensive line. I do think they're going to add to the defensive line even more, maybe add a defensive tackle in the draft. We'll see what they do, but I think Danielle Hunter is a major, great add there from them. They had a great offseason, adding Joe Mixon, adding Stephon Diggs, and then obviously adding Danielle Hunter. They really just went all in. Moving on, the Jacksonville Jaguars gave Josh Allen a 5-year, $150 million contract extension with $88 million in guaranteed money. The Jaguars went all in here to make sure he stayed in Jacksonville. This is a little bit unprecedented for the Jacksonville Jaguars. They've only signed just 3 first-round picks to a second contract since 2008, and obviously adding a pass rusher like him in the draft was obviously huge a few years ago back in 2019, and now they get him locked up for a long-term deal. He had a career-high 17.5 sacks this past season. The Jaguars definitely need to keep him, so it makes sense for them to go out and give him a big deal. Leonard Floyd signed a 2-year, $20 million deal with the 49ers. He tied a career-high 10.5 sacks this past season for the Buffalo Bills. The Niners moved on from Chase Young and Eric Armstead. And then you also add in Dre Greenlaw's injury during the Super Bowl. They had a lot of major moves now this offseason with their defense losing a lot of pieces. So going out and getting Leonard Floyd definitely made a lot of sense. Shaq Barrett signed a 1-year, $9 million deal with the Miami Dolphins. He had only 7.5 sacks in the last 2 seasons in 24 games, which isn't very great. But in 2021, he was a Pro Bowler with 10 sacks. Giving him just 1 year, $9 million isn't a bad deal at all. Low risk, high reward potential here for Miami, who lost a lot on their defense. Christian Wilkins, Xavier Howard, Van Ginkel, Jerome Baker. They lost a lot of pieces there. Obviously, Andrew Van Ginkel going to the Vikings, getting a big deal. Jerome Baker leaving, Christian Wilkins leaving, Xavier Howard leaving. They lost a lot of pieces this offseason. So going out and adding a potential vet, that could be a good piece for them in Shaq Barrett for just $9 million makes sense. Chase Young signed a 1-year, $13 million deal with the New Orleans Saints. This will be his 3rd team within a year. He had 7.5 total sacks this past season between Washington and San Francisco. He's just never healthy enough. He never lived up to that top 3 pick hype when he was coming out of Ohio State. We'll see what he does in New Orleans. They obviously need help on that defensive line, but at the end of the day, he just never lived up to the hype that he got coming out of the draft. Next up, Zadarius Smith signed a 2-year, $23.5 million deal with the Cleveland Browns. Just 5.5 sacks this past season for the Browns after having 10 in 2022 in Minnesota. But Cleveland wanted to keep him. He's a key part of the defense from this past season, a defense that was one of the best in the NFL, so it makes sense for them to keep him around as well. Moving on to defensive line. The longtime Eagles defensive lineman Fletcher Cox retired, 6-time Pro Bowler, 1-time All-Pro, and a Super Bowl champ. He still had 5 sacks this past season. Still wasn't bad on the defensive line. He still could play. But the Eagles, obviously, now are missing pieces with Jason Kelce leaving and Fletcher Cox leaving. You're losing 2 contributors on both sides of the ball, but obviously 2 veterans as well. We'll see how they deal with that in the draft. I do think they add a defensive lineman at some point. The perennial All-Pro defensive lineman Aaron Donald retired from the NFL, 111 sacks in his career, 543 combined tackles, 8-time All-Pro, 10-time Pro Bowler, 3-time Defensive Player of the Year, and a 1-time Super Bowl champ. A first ballot Hall of Famer for sure. Look for the Rams to add to their defensive line in the draft, potentially in the first round. This is definitely a major loss, but it's not really too surprising. Aaron Donald said last year could have been his last year. I remember after they won the Super Bowl, there was a major question on whether or not he was going to come back. He ends up coming back for an extra 2 seasons after that, but now that'll be it for him in the NFL. Next up, one of the best defensive linemen in the NFL besides Aaron Donald, Chris Jones stays put in Kansas City. 5 years, $160 million extension with $101 million guaranteed. Jones said last year that he was a Chief for life, and obviously that makes sense now getting that major extension. 10.5 sacks this past season, a ton of money, but they always find ways to get around the salary cap through signing bonuses. We'll see how it works out with Kansas City, but they had to keep him around somehow, some way, especially considering how big of a piece he's been for them during their dynasty. Moving on to the Raiders, they made a big move to their defensive line, adding Christian Wilkins on a 4-year, $110 million deal, 65 tackles and a career-high 9.5 sacks this past season for Miami. The Raiders got a good defensive line, Max Crosby, now adding in Christian Wilkins, and then Tyree Wilson was a top 10 pick this past season. I know he really didn't do too much this past year, but I do think he's going to break out in year 2 in the NFL. I do expect him to have a better year, especially considering now the opposing offensive lines have to get ready for Crosby, Wilkins. I think now Tyree Wilson will have a chance to have a good season this year, especially considering he's now got a year under his belt. He's got a little bit more experience. I expect him to take a step up. Next up, the Ravens are keeping Justin Madubuike around on a 4-year, $98 million deal. He's going to stay put in Baltimore. He had a career-high 13 sacks this past season. Baltimore keeps him in place on a defense that lost a lot in free agency. I do think $98 million is a little bit too much. He really had a great 2023 where he had 56 combined tackles, 13 sacks, and 12 tackles for a loss. In 2021 and 2022, he had 2 sacks and 5.5 sacks in those years, respectively, with 5 quarterback hits, 9 quarterback hits, 7 tackles for a loss, and 8 tackles for a loss. This past year, though, 33 quarterback hits was definitely a major upgrade considering he only had 16 quarterback hits in his first 3 years in the NFL. This past year, 33. So he doubled his total from his previous 3 years in just 1 season. So obviously a great year, but I do think it's a little bit too much just based off of 1 very good season. He had 2 good years before that, 1 excellent season, but he gets a payday, 4 years, $98 million. Now moving on to Andrew Van Ginkel, who got a 2-year, $40 million deal with the Minnesota Vikings. He had a career high in sacks this past season for Miami. Is a major loss for them at the linebacker position. I like this add a lot for Minnesota. They need to add to their defense, and now they get Van Ginkel, a guy who's a great hustler and a good tackler as well. Kenneth Murray signed a 2-year, $18 million deal with the Tennessee Titans. He tied a career-high 107 combined tackles this past season for the Chargers. Also had a career-high 3.5 sacks this past season for the Chargers as well. This is definitely a major loss for the LA defense. Also, this team's lost a lot of pieces overall, especially on their offense. Losing Austin Eckler, I know he was declining last year, but he's still a loss. Losing Austin Eckler, losing Mike Williams, and then losing Keenan Allen in the trade. They did lose a good amount of pieces there. The Keenan Allen trade was definitely surprising to me. The Bears only had to give up a 4th-round pick in exchange for Keenan Allen. I know his contract is a little bit of a mess. He's entering the final year of his deal, and if the Chargers want to keep him around, they probably would have had to give him an extension to try to lower his cap hit, and that didn't seem like the best idea for them. So they end up moving on from him. It makes a little more sense for the Bears, trying to add some receivers around Caleb Williams. He's going to want some more help besides, obviously, DJ Moore. So you add DeAndre Swift, you add Keenan Allen, and you potentially could even add another receiver with the 9th overall pick. It's definitely a loss for the Chargers, though. Definitely a loss for Justin Herbert. Last year, Keenan Allen was one of the best receivers in the NFL. I know he's battled injuries over the last 4 or 5 years, but when he is on the field, he is a very good receiver. Now it opens the door for the Chargers to go out and get a receiver with the 5th overall pick. Moving on now to Patrick Queen, who signed a 3-year, $41 million deal with the Pittsburgh Steelers. He had a career-high 133 combined tackles this season for Baltimore, with 9 tackles for a loss. He was an all-pro for a reason, definitely a huge loss for Baltimore, and a definitely good add for Pittsburgh. They wanted to add to their linebacking core, and now they get a very good tackling linebacker in Patrick Queen. He's going to stay in the division and go from the Ravens to the Steelers. Moving on now to the Eagles, who signed former Bucs linebacker Devin White to a 1-year, $7.5 million deal. The Eagles need help at linebacker, and this is great value considering he's only getting $7.5 million. He didn't have 100 combined tackles this season like he did in the 3 seasons prior. In 2020, he had 140 combined tackles with 9 sacks. In 2021, 3.5 sacks with 128 combined tackles. 2022, 124 combined tackles with 5.5 sacks. This past season, just 2.5 sacks, which ties a career low that he had from his rookie year, and also had a career low in combined tackles with just 83. He did miss 3 games though this past season. As a Giants fan, I'm not too happy with him being on the Eagles, especially considering the defense already has a lot of talent, but it made sense for them to go out and get a linebacker, and especially at that price, just $7.5 million. That's a great ad from Howie Roseman. We'll see how things work out for him in Philadelphia. Now moving on to the cornerback position, Darius Williams goes back to the team that he won the Super Bowl with, and that's the LA Rams, getting a 3-year, $22.5 million deal. He tied a career high in interceptions this past season with 4 as a Jacksonville Jaguar. A major issue for him, though, this past year were missed tackles. 10 missed tackles this past season, which is a career high. That's definitely a worry, but he goes back to a system that he was very comfortable in and won a Super Bowl in, and obviously the Rams need help at cornerback, so going out and getting him is definitely a good ad. I know Sean McVay will be happy with that. Moving on to Jalen Johnson, who re-signed with the Chicago Bears on a 4-year, $76 million deal. He had a career high this past season in interceptions, a career year all around, 4 interceptions, was a second-team All-Pro. Keeping him was a major priority for Chicago this offseason, along with figuring out the quarterback situation. The number 1 overall pick will be Caleb Williams, and they also added a receiver in Keenan Allen. So they got Johnson back, which was a major issue for them. Getting Keenan Allen back was a major add for them at wide receiver, and they're also figuring out the quarterback, going out and getting Caleb Williams. Ryan Poles has done a tremendous job in the Windy City in just his second year. They're already figuring things out and trending upwards. I would have kept Justin Fields and maybe traded down from that number 1 pick, but they're going to go out and get Caleb Williams. There's nothing I could have done about that. I know I voiced my opinion about all my support I've had for Justin Fields, but they're going out and they're getting Caleb Williams. There's not really much any Chicago Bears fan could do. If they supported Justin Fields, they wanted to keep him. The Bears are probably going to move on from him just because it made sense, considering they don't have to pay a rookie quarterback for 3 or 4 years, and Justin Fields would be a free agent next season. So they went out and made that decision, and they've obviously built around Caleb Williams this offseason, adding in a lot. I do expect them to add to their offensive line at some point and potentially add another receiver in the draft. But obviously Ryan Poles, definitely a good start to his career there in Chicago. Next up, L'Jarius Sneed was franchise tagged by Kansas City, but then was traded to the Tennessee Titans for a 3rd-round pick. Then he got a 4-year, $76 million deal from Tennessee with $55 million guaranteed. He had a very good season this past year, 78 combined tackles, a career-high 14 pass deflections with 2 interceptions. He also led the NFL among defensive backs with 75 targets. He led the NFL in fewest yards per attempt allowed, with just 4.7. So a very good season. I wanted the Giants to go out and trade for him. Just a 3rd-round pick would have been a great add to the Giants' defense, but they end up not getting him. They're probably going to now add a cornerback at some point in the draft, but definitely a great trade there for Tennessee. I love that move for them. Moving on to safety now, C.J. Gardner-Johnson goes back to the team he helped make the Super Bowl, and that's the Philadelphia Eagles. He gets a 3-year, $27 million deal from them. He had a career-high 6 interceptions in his lone season in Philly in 2022 before signing with Detroit in free agency last year. Things didn't work out for him in Detroit, though. Just played in 3 games this past season, had 1 interception and 17 combined tackles. Philadelphia needed help in their secondary, so I do think this is a good move for them. From what I saw from him, though, in Detroit, I didn't think he was that great in coverage, but he was better in coverage with the Philadelphia Eagles, so we'll see how things work out for him there. And obviously, Philadelphia needed to add to their secondary, especially considering their secondary was a major weakness for them this past season. Now moving on to the Giants, signing Jalen Mills, former defensive back for the Patriots and the Eagles, will be signing with the New York Giants. Mills made 45 tackles this past season for the Giants. Secondary is a weakness for them, and I expect them to probably add another cornerback at some point in this year's draft. Cornerback and safety, both of them will be added in this year's draft at some point. Jason Pinnock, though, coming back for the Giants is definitely huge, especially considering how good of a value contract that is. Just around $1 or $2 million per year is definitely one of the best value contracts in the NFL. Moving on to Kevin Byard, who signed a 2-year, $15 million deal with the Chicago Bears. No longer the all-pro safety he once was, but still a good player. Had a career-high 122 combined tackles this past season between the Tennessee Titans and Philadelphia Eagles. Did have an interception as well. Did really struggle in coverage, though, allowing a 103.3 passer rating when targeted on the Eagles. Didn't look good in Philadelphia at all. Philly took a shot in trading for him. Things didn't work out, obviously. Moving on to Xavier McKinney, who got a 4-year, $68 million deal from the Green Bay Packers. He had 3 interceptions this past season for the Giants, played every snap of the season alongside Bobby Okereke. Those 2 guys did not miss a snap for the Giants this season on defense, which is very impressive. McKinney has battled injuries in the past, not this past season, but in years past. Still a very good player. Had 2 fumble recoveries and a career-high 116 combined tackles this past season for the Giants, allowing just a 69.8 passer rating this past season when targeted. He was much better in coverage this season than he was in 2022. Did struggle tackling, though. He did miss 8 tackles this past season. I did feel like there were some games I didn't see enough hustle out of him. In the last couple of games of the year, I definitely saw it, maybe because he was waiting for a contract. But at the end of the day, I did feel fine with the Giants moving on from him and just letting him go get his money, and the Giants trying to address it in free agency or in the draft at a cheaper cost. Next up, Kyle Duggar agreed to a 4-year, $58 million extension with the New England Patriots, worth up to $66 million total. He had 109 combined tackles this past season, 2 interceptions. He was a lot better the last few years than I thought he would be, especially when he was drafted. I wasn't very high on him, but he did prove me wrong. He was a very good player for the Patriots this past season. A little bit of a hefty pay grade there, but the Patriots do have money to spend, so they end up going and breaking the bank to keep him around. Antoine Winfield was franchise tagged by the Tampa Bay Bucks. They're still looking to keep him around on a long-term extension. He had a career-high 6 sacks this past season. Also career-high in combined tackles with 122. Had 3 interceptions, 6 tackles for loss. And was an all-pro in 2023. Had a very good year. Tampa Bay had to keep him. They probably don't want to give him the money that Xavier McKinney got. We'll see if an extension is worked out this offseason. And last thing I'm going to talk about is Zach Wilson was given permission to seek a trade by the Jets just about a month ago now, maybe a month and a half ago. So the Zach Wilson era in New York is likely over, which isn't too surprising. But I think a major question that people were talking about when this news came out is who was given the worst hand? Who was dealt the worst hand among the 2021 first-round quarterbacks? Was it Trevor Lawrence? Was it Zach Wilson? Was it Trey Lance? Was it Justin Fields? Or was it Mac Jones? None of them really stepped into good situations. I have to say it was probably Mac Jones or Zach Wilson. I think Trey Lance was given a good situation in San Francisco. Gets hurt. Obviously, Brock Purdy ends up being the guy there, and they end up trading him. That was tough, but he did step into a good situation when he was drafted. As for the other guys, the Jaguars weren't in a good position, especially with Urban Meyer as a quarterback when Trevor Lawrence stepped in. Zach Wilson never really had too much around him on the offensive line, and obviously being in New York in a big market, the fans were against him right away, it seemed like. As for Justin Fields, Chicago really didn't build around him too much until the last year. He took a step up, obviously getting DJ Moore, but before that, they really didn't have too much around him to help him succeed. And then Mac Jones really wasn't dealt a fair hand either in New England. Obviously didn't have weapons this past season. And at the end of the day, I know no quarterback is really going to step into a perfect situation. I'm not saying things have to be perfect for them, but at the end of the day, you do have to look at what they have around them and try to see if they had maybe a little bit more, if they would be a little better. I have to say probably Mac Jones and Zach Wilson was given the worst hand out of those guys. Zach Wilson has shown flashes of what he's capable of, like we saw on Sunday Night Football this past season against Kansas City. But the problem with Zach Wilson is inconsistency. I'd love to see him play more confidently. Maybe a market like New York isn't the best for him where the pressure is just ridiculous when you're struggling. I did think he matured a lot, though, as a player this past season. As for Mac Jones, he played with arguably the worst receiving corps in the NFL this past season, and an offensive line that struggled as well. Also added all the hate he got from the fans over the last couple of years, and the fact that in 2022, Matt Patricia and Joe Judge were his offensive coordinators. Judge ruined Daniel Jones. He set him back years. Daniel Jones had a very good rookie year, and then Joe Judge stepped in for 2 years, and Daniel Jones regressed. And the same thing for Mac Jones. Mac Jones had Joe Judge on his offense for 2 years. After a very good rookie year, Joe Judge steps in, and in years 2 and 3, Mac Jones takes a step back. So it's not really too surprising to see Mac Jones take a step back the last few years. I do think he was dealt a bad hand, and the same thing with Daniel Jones. But obviously things were tough there for Mac Jones, considering he had to follow up essentially Tom Brady. I know they had Cam Newton as a bridge quarterback, but Cam Newton was never the franchise quarterback. But when you draft a guy in the first round like Mac Jones, he was supposed to be the guy, and so there's obviously a lot more pressure on him than there would have been if he was drafted, let's say, in the third round to be a backup. I think Zach Wilson could be a quality starter elsewhere. I didn't like him coming out of the draft. I thought he would be a bust. That was my prediction. But then he really grew on me because of all the hate he received from the New York media and the fans. That made me root for him. The arm talent's there. He just needs better decision-making and better poise in the pocket. That's obviously a major part of being a quarterback in the NFL, so it's not like I'm saying it's an easy tweak. He does have a lot to work on, but if he plays confidently, I think he could be a solid quarterback. I wouldn't mind the Giants trading a 7th-round pick for him. A 7th-round pick wouldn't be too much. Mac Jones went for a 6th-round pick. Justin Fields went for a 6th-round pick with the potential for that being a 4th-round pick. So there's not really too much that quarterbacks are going to trade for nowadays. Zach Wilson could probably be traded for a 7th-round pick. I wouldn't the Giants just giving a low-risk, potential good reward there if he ends up being a solid backup or maybe a starter if Daniel Jones were to ever get hurt. We'll see what the Giants do in the draft. There's a chance they do go out and draft a quarterback. I don't think Drew Lock being the backup quarterback means the Giants aren't going to go out and draft a quarterback. I would keep Daniel Jones. I have full faith in him in being the guy, as you guys know. I think Daniel Jones at some point is going to figure things out. He's just never had a number one receiver in New York. The Giants went out and got Kenny Golladay, and that completely failed. Wan'Dale Robinson's probably the best receiver he's worked with, and he's probably a wide receiver 2 on most teams. I do like Sterling Shepard a lot, but he was never in his prime when Daniel Jones was here. So I would say the best receiver that he's had to work with is Wan'Dale Robinson. And obviously a very weak offensive line and a fan base that's been against him his whole entire career, it seems like. Especially this past season, everybody's against Daniel Jones. We'll see what the Giants do in the draft. I know a lot of people like to hate on Daniel Jones' contract, 4 years, $160 million. The funny thing is this, everyone says, oh, he got so much money, $160 million, but the Giants can get out of his contract after this upcoming season and only have $19 million in dead money. Nobody's really talking about that. No one talks about Daniel Jones not having a number one receiver. Like most quarterbacks in the NFL that have struggled, and then they get a number one receiver and look good. Like we saw with Josh Allen getting Stephon Diggs. And obviously Diggs got better as well with Josh Allen. But Diggs helped Josh Allen step up. Trevor Lawrence looked a lot better this year with Calvin Ridley. It helps having a number one receiver. It really does. So I'd love to see Daniel Jones throw to Rome Odunze. I didn't really like what Malik Nabers had to say about Daniel Jones. He didn't really say anything bad about Daniel Jones, but he said something like, they know they need to have a quarterback to get me the ball, and basically saying Daniel Jones probably isn't that guy that could get him the ball. Not really too sure what he completely meant there, but I wasn't really a fan of that. I think Odunze, though, could be the guy for the Giants. I was highest on Odunze during the season, and then after the season was over, I watched a lot more Malik Nabers film, and I became a lot more of a fan of him, and I think after watching his film, I thought he was the best receiver in this draft. So I think Malik Nabers is probably number one. I think Odunze's right there at number two. And then I'd probably put Marvin Harrison Jr. at three. I think he's going to be a good receiver. I just don't think he's going to be an all-time great like most people are expecting. We'll see when the draft comes around. It's still a week away. I'll give my full thoughts and opinions on all these players. I still want to watch a little bit more film before I give another mock draft, which will probably be tomorrow. I'll give a new mock draft. But there's obviously a lot to figure out here for the Giants. I do think Daniel Jones could be the guy, but I do think there's a chance they go out and get a quarterback with the 6th overall pick. Do I want J.J. McCarthy? No. Do I want Drake May? No. I do like Michael Penix Jr. a lot. I think he's the best quarterback in this year's draft. He's probably the only guy I'd say, yeah, if the Giants took him at 6th or took him later in the first round, I'd be fine if they compete with Daniel Jones. I don't want Drake May. I don't want J.J. McCarthy. I don't want Bo Nix. I'd keep Daniel Jones in that case. I'm very high on Daniel Jones. I think at some point he's going to win a Super Bowl. I know it sounds crazy. I know it's a major hot take. I know people are going to disagree with me, and that's fine. And that's what sports podcasting is all about. Obviously, there's a lot of hot takes, and people aren't going to agree with you all the time, and that's the beauty of sports. Everyone can have their own opinion. But I do think Daniel Jones is going to make 2 Super Bowls in the next 10 years, and I think he wins one of them. I know it sounds crazy, but I have that much faith in Daniel Jones. I think he wins a Super Bowl, whether it's in New York or elsewhere. I think he wins a Super Bowl in the next 10 years. I know most people wouldn't agree with me on that. I know a lot of people would be upset hearing that. It's a major hot take, I know, but I've supported Daniel Jones since day one. I'm probably his biggest fan out there. And I feel like it's my job to go out there and defend him since no one else is. Everybody loves to bash Daniel Jones. Everybody loves to say the Giants going to move on from him and the Giants don't have any faith in him and the Giants don't like him at all. That's what everyone loves saying. That's just a popular thing to do. As I said before a million times in this podcast, everybody loves just to jump on what the popular thing is to say and the trendy thing to say is. And obviously the trendy thing right now about Daniel Jones is he's injury prone, he's a bust, he's overrated, he's not good. Those are the trendy things to say. But I don't really just follow the trendy things just because that's what everyone else is saying. I base it off of what I see in a quarterback and what I see in a player. I just give you my honest opinion. And with Daniel Jones, he's never got a fair shake in New York. And you also add in the fact that he's had injuries, obviously, which obviously some fluke injuries haven't really been his fault. He tried to play through a torn ACL for a play last year and then just tore his leg even worse. It seems like he's a good guy, a great locker room guy who's trying hard, puts in all the work, puts in all the effort. I know he wants to be great. You can just tell. And I know people are going to disagree with me, and that's fine at the end of the day. I stopped arguing about Daniel Jones and trying to defend it with people just because if people don't like him and they're not a fan of him, they're going to stay on that side, and I'm going to stay on the side of supporting Daniel Jones anyways and being a fan of him. So sometimes it's not even worth arguing because you know you're going to still support him and you know the other person's not going to be a fan of him anyways. So sometimes it's better just not to even argue and just say we agree to disagree. And that's what I've done for the most part here with Daniel Jones, especially over the last year. I don't really need to argue with people online or obviously argue with friends over whether or not Daniel Jones can be a winning quarterback in the NFL. I still have full faith in him, and I believe he can be the guy for the Giants. I truly do. Anyways, that'll wrap up this episode. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to this. As always, I appreciate it. I hope you guys have a good one. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you.